Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Mutual Aid Podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things mutual aid. This show is supported by From the Periphery, a media collective founded by activists, analysts, and media workers to build internationalist dialogues from below and connect struggles from around the world. If you want to support this show and the collective around it, please consider heading over to patreon.com/fromtheperiphery and become a member for as little as $5 a month. Becoming a member not only helps support our work, but also gives you access to exclusive content and early access and a lot of other fun stuff. And so with that said, here's another episode of the Mutual Aid Podcast. Hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Mutual Aid Podcast. I'm your host Ayman. With me is Israa.
Hi everyone.
And today we're going to be interviewing a very special person who many of you may know. Their name is Yaffa, and they are a queer trans Palestinian activist. Yaffa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, but you covered most of it. Yeah, a trans Palestinian organizer. I'm a mental health worker, a death worker, a birthing worker, and a writer.
Yes, you write very lovely poetry. I've only skimmed through Blood Orange, but I very much so intend to. I knew when touching it that I was like, I need to be emotionally in a certain space to engage fully, and I'm looking forward to it. But today we're going to be talking about your mutual aid work and your engagement and involvement and a lot of the sort of knowledge production you do, but also the actual work, not the actual work, they're both actual work, but your engagement in mutual aid, most notably as far as I've seen, but obviously you can talk a lot more about other aspects of it. You often do posts on Instagram with a fundraiser for queer and trans Palestinian, like a solidarity fund. So yeah, I think first of all, if you could talk more about how you engage with mutual aid, what sort of mutual aid activities do you involve yourself in, and why mutual aid, what you see in it and what potential, and why you've chosen this to be sort of a path for your political activities.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, mutual aid is something I grew up with, right? And I like going back to the very start of my life, right? Where my parents had just been displaced from Kuwait post the Gulf War, and I was born a few months later. And I like starting with that because if you can imagine what that looks like, right? If you pack a bag, you drive it across a desert, and you're starting over, it automatically requires that the community is going to take care of one another. You just have to, right? It's not something that we sit around a table and we're like, should we do this? Should we not do this? Does this align with us? Does it not? You have to do it. And so I was raised in a world where mutual aid, community care, things like that were always the norm. And as I got older, I left home when I was 16, 17, and was living in the north of Jordan, and going kind of between Daraa and Syria and Idlib at the time. And the Syrian Revolution started the end of that year. And so that was the first time that I really got involved more as, even though I was still 17, as more as an adult, and doing kind of my own work versus just the work that I had witnessed all around me throughout my life. And kind of noticing the realities of how it's really us who have to take care of one another and the complexity of doing that within all of these other systems and how care work in general is always going to be political, but that level of political also varies drastically. And so since then, I've lived in, I want to say, 6 different countries, and each of them have their own relationships with mutual aid, right? Their own relationships with reciprocity and community care. And even the concept of charity looks very different from one place to another. And so since then, I've kind of just been building on that practice. And often, I usually have some kind of mutual aid practice that's been ongoing. So for these last approximately 15 years, And also, I will launch larger scale initiatives when crisis happens. So, when the 2016 elections were happening, for example, or when COVID happened, or when October 7th happened, and so currently I manage various funds. The number kind of fluctuates from time to time just based on needs. But usually I have about five ongoing. And so the Instagram that you mentioned is part of one of those funds. The writing that we mentioned earlier is a part of two separate funds. Um, but then there are three other funds as well. And so the way that I usually structure my mutual aid work is uh, I try to diversify it as much as possible where it's not in one area or another. Um, it allows me to pivot and move in a way where I can always be supporting the community in the ways that they need me to. And I will say, of like within those funds, I usually will brand all of it as like community care. But within that, some of it is mutual aid and some of it is not mutual aid. Because for me, mutual aid is a mutual practice for surviving and dismantling systems of oppression. Um, and there's a lot of work that happens within the world of what we call mutual aid. That to me, I don't necessarily classify it as mutual aid. However, publicly, potentially for strategic reasons, right, to leverage additional resources or things like that, I could potentially group it under it. But I do within my own work try to differentiate the difference between like redistributing resources and mutual aid. And as an example of that, it's like when so, for example, the funds largely encompass supporting queer and trans people impacted by genocide anywhere. So it could be in Palestine, it could be in Lebanon, it could be Sudan, the Congo, Kashmir, Puerto Rico. It could be in a multitude of different places. It could be Indigenous folks, Indigenous to Turtle Island. It could be Black folks. It could be a lot of different groups of people as long as they're queer or trans. Um, when I support people who are, for example, building with me, right? And we're co-organizing and we're supporting one another in different ways, and there's that mutuality within it. That to me is where it's mutual aid, right? And that's the majority of the funds. This past year, I was able to redistribute about $500,000, or a little bit over 500,000. I would say like over maybe like 60% of that was more mutual aid, right? There's that relationship building component. The politics is not just the politics of things have been moved, but rather it's because funds were moved or different resources were moved, it puts us at a better political standing to dismantle systems of oppression. But then, you have a side of my work which is resources and funds and things like that go directly into people experiencing genocide on the ground. So thinking of the queer and trans Palestinians in Gaza or in Sudan, for example, um, that I will support. And for me, that is a lot more resource redistribution versus mutual aid, because to me, it's not really that reciprocal relationship in the same way. We're not world building in the same way that I would with organizers around the world who have the privilege of not being in a genocide zone in that moment in time. But my funds kind of like encompass all of that. And so it's kind of cool to have a mix of different work, but I do like to differentiate um, between the different ones because I think when we group everything into a single definition, it makes it really easy to hijack that definition and that concept. And so I like breaking things down and being like, okay, it's not mutual aid if it doesn't meet this criteria. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Actually, we still want you to do it, but work to build actual authentic mutual aid. So you have a direction to go, but you have a starting point. Whereas I find if we call everything mutual aid, then our starting point and our end goal are the same. And so we
Mm.
kind of just end up doing like almost like one layer of things. And we're like, well, we're doing this. And then sometimes we're like, actually, you're really not. right? Like, it's cute that you're doing this. We love that you're doing this. And also, we need you to do a lot more because you're not actually meeting those criteria. And I know you, in the conversation you all had with like Dean, you went into that a little bit more as well.
Oh, so I'd love to hear what that criteria is for you.
I think for me, the major criteria is the first one's the mutuality piece, right, which is built into the name. Um, and so for me, with mutual aid, um, if it's not a reciprocal relationship, right, if we can't name why mutual aid is a part of both of our survivals, if we can't name how systems of oppression
Hmm.
are targeting both of us, to me, that mutuality doesn't exist. And it's not saying that like then we can't do work. It's saying that like why do we need to call everything mutual aid, right? To me, without mutuality, then that's resource redistribution. And resource redistribution is really beautiful, right? We need additional resources. We need to be moving resources into different pockets of places to be able to actually do real, authentic mutual aid. And so for me, that mutuality is really, really important. The dismantling systems of oppression piece is really, really critical as well. Um, and this is where I think there's like a full spectrum of what that looks like. Some people will define that as more of that care work is always going to be radical, right? Of like supporting an individual who is marginalized, that the system is trying to kill, is us doing something against the system. And uh, it, and I'm here for the full spectrum, right? So I'm not here to hate on half the spectrum or anything like that. What I will say though is that again, I want us to be really clear with language and the work that we're doing. So if I go and support a queer and trans Palestinian in Gaza, for example, I am supporting them as an individual potentially, or I am supporting them as a community. And to me, those are two different things, right? And the types of people that I support would be different. And so, and I'll give an example of that just in general, whether it's in Gaza or anywhere else in the world. And I will say of like Gaza, Sudan, like active genocide zones, I have it's a very different relationship, which is why I go with more resource redistribution there. But for example, if I'm supporting um, like usually within my mutual aid, for example, when it comes to funds, um, this past year, I've been able to get people a decent amount of money, which I think is necessary because of inflation and, $50 is not going to cut it anymore. And so usually the individuals that I support will be receiving between like two and $4,000. So, because rent is expensive, everything is expensive, everyone has medical debt everywhere. There's just a lot happening, right? And so that $2,000, let's say that I gave an individual, can go and pay someone's rent. So, depending on the person, for some people, if you give them $2,000, whether through mutual aid, resource redistribution, or anything else, they will take that $2,000 and that $2,000 disappears into rent.
Hmm.
And then there are other people that you can give $2,000, and because it's genuine mutual aid, they recognize that it's an investment into their community. And so what they're able to do now, because they have received this $2,000 and now they have capacity and space to not have to deal with getting that $2,000, what they will end up doing within their community is absolutely incredible in terms of their own organizing or the care work that they're doing within their own family structures and their own communities and so on and so forth. Um, and so for me, it's I'm here for supporting as many marginalized people as possible. And also within my work in particular, when it is mutual aid, it is individuals who, again, outside of the active genocide zones, are individuals who recognize that we are all investments into one another's lives and we're all building a collectively liberated world. That this isn't about resource is shared. It's resources are shared mutually as an investment to dismantle systems of oppression. It's not just about the survival piece.
I'm really actually appreciating your breakdown on here because this is something I've been thinking a lot myself in my own work with Gaza over the last since October 7th. And my partner on the ground, this is something we talk about, especially in the context of what happens when the bombs stop. And right now, it's like you say, it's a whole different context. It's just about survival. It's about getting the funds in, making sure people have access to food, water, the basic stuff to help them to survive. And while when I'm in conversations with him, we talk about the politics and we're bringing in and where there's an education between the two of us and how this is political, and we're trying to mold our outreach right to the general public in that way, where we try to position it like this is our form of resistance, this is how this work is political, this is why we do this stuff, and this is how we engage in it. But the reality is, like, as people are like the ones who are giving funds, they're not necessarily we're not building deeper community with them, right? We're not engaging them in a way. It's like, how are you looking at how this dismantles systems of oppression? How are you looking at your positionality within this process? And so it does, like you say, it is more resource distribution right now. And so there's like this constant tension of like, well, yeah, we're doing this because of the political situation, and this is a political response. And it's not, we're not, it, for me, it doesn't feel like we're building alternative systems yet because of the situation. So I'm really appreciating what you're bringing in right here. And like the question for me is coming up right now is how did you, like, how are you approaching, like, how are you defining these, like, you're talking about the criteria of mutual aid versus resource distribution, but also like, as someone who is invested in building alternatives, how are you yourself making sure that you're not falling into the trap of just resource distribution or just charity work or just aid work? So like, what does it look like for you to separate and also keep an eye on the bigger picture that you're working towards?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And I love your reflection on the work that you're doing. And yeah, I feel like there's so much beauty in all this work, in the multitudes of ways that it happens. And um, I feel like a core like ingredient to all of this is asking those questions. And I feel like, to kind of answer your question, uh, I think it's consistently and constantly asking myself and the people I work with some of those questions. And I think for me in particular, part of the way that I avoid moving into just one bucket or another is that my work has always been expansive to include all of it. And I find that that allows me to be really strategic in terms of how things move, how fundraising happens, how I access resources, how I build relationships. And so my work has never been there, like, there's never been a time when my work has been like, okay, this is exactly what mutual aid is supposed to look like. This is only what it is and nothing else. My work has always been all of these different buckets combined. And I will say for me, in terms of like where these definitions come from, they come very chaotically, right? And I think y'all talked about this in previous episodes, right? Where there's actually very little
Mm-hmm.
written about this work, right? And whenever something is written about this work, it becomes the all-encompassing Bible, more or less. And but this work is layered, right? Like this is not mutual aid is not this single thing,
Yeah.
right? It's meant to be layered. It's meant to meet people where they're at. It's meant to be a way for us to do this work. But so it just over time throughout my own work, then I will define things and redefine things. And so if you ask me next week, I might have completely different definitions. But today, and especially as I was like thinking about this podcast, it actually gave me space to like really reflect on some of these
Mm-hmm.
definitions within myself. Because you also mentioned the building alternative systems, and that to me is when I move things to community care, which I'm still not 100% sure how I'm differentiating community care and mutual aid, except for the fact that to me, mutual aid doesn't exist in a liberated world. So when we're done, right, when we've dismantled all these systems, there is no more mutual aid, right? Because if we're saying mutual aid is political and it's about dismantling systems of oppression, then that means it disappears once those systems are gone. But to me, community care is just standard. Community care is just something that's existed across time and space and will always exist across time and space. It is never a response to to oppressive systems. It could be a part of all these other things that we're talking about, but it kind of exists outside of it. It's just the way that we are with one another. And that to me is where like I focus my building alternative systems work. Um, but I've always had a wide array of like diverse things that I do versus just one or the other. And I will say, if I find most places don't do that. Um, and it's always like semi confused me in a way because, um, I learned again, I learned this work through survival, right? As a child and growing in a world that wanted to kill me in every
Mm.
single way and kill my parents and my family. And here we are, right? And kill the community that I
Yeah.
was a part of, right? So even like I was born in Jordan, so we had a bunch of mutual aid work there. Moved to Arizona, still living in severe poverty. The vast majority of our community um, were either newer immigrants, and then a lot of Black Americans and Indigenous folks. And it was interesting being a part of that kind of space, right? Where we could come from all over the world. Some are indigenous to Turtle Island itself, and yet we're all barely surviving. And so we still need each other to survive. Um, but within all of that, I've also learned to tap into power structures. And as we're dismantling these systems, I'm also like, okay, how do we get the most out of these systems? And, sometimes people hear that and they'll be like, oh, well, the revolution will not be funded. And I look around and I'm like, oh, where is the revolution? Do you see her? Like, is she, did I miss it? Is it behind that? Like, what are
Yeah.
we talking about? Like, I'm like, when the revolution is here, yeah, money
Yeah.
doesn't exist. Until then, like we are getting people as many resources as possible because even with as many resources as we can access, we're still barely
Yeah.
scratching
Yeah.
the surface, right? We're barely surviving. And so usually when I do my work, it's kind of a mix of all of that. And then I think also because of the way I was raised, so I was a lot more I understood underground organizing a lot more than I did, well, maybe not a lot more than I did like visible organizing, but especially with 9/11. So I was still in Arizona when 9/11 happened. Everything moved
Yeah.
underground. I was 9 years old at the time. Everything moved underground. And so a lot of my formative years in terms of understanding how this work functions is that it's underground. And one thing that happens with underground is that you build this relationship with what is visible and what is invisible, and you
Mm.
weaponize it, right? You weaponize it against these
Mm.
systems of oppression. And so a lot of my work now, when people look at it, um, it's kind of really fascinating because I think people see me on social media and they assume that that's the work that I do. And I want them to think that, right? Like that's incredibly strategic. And it's kind of funny because what most people don't realize, and I will talk about this because it's not like my risk level is always high, so it really doesn't matter. But I tell people of like when you see me the most is when I'm doing the most
Mm.
underground work because I choose where you focus on. And I think growing up in that world where you have that relationship between what is underground, what is not, you also learn to diversify things. Because if you create a single structure and you really understand state and community violence, you know that it could disappear
Yeah.
within
Yeah.
hours, right? Like everything that you've built can just disappear. And so I always build 5, 6, 7 funds, different platforms where when one is targeted, it's fine. I'm like, yeah, you can have that one, right? Like, I don't need all of them all at the same time. Um, and that's happened in the last
Yeah.
15 months, right? Different ones have been compromised at different ways, whether it's state violence or community violence. Different bank accounts have been shut, right? Different people have been targeted. Um, I'm always heavily targeted. And also the work continued, right? Because again, some is visible, some is invisible. And even from the visible, because I don't hide the fact that there's a bunch of different funds, for a targeted campaign to attack all of them all at the same time would be so much more labor for everybody else to try to destroy. And so I always at least have several that are still fully operational as I rebuild some of the other ones if now we're missing specific angles or different things. And so that kind of allows me to always be a little bit ahead of being swept away with like this is turning entirely to resource redistribution and now we're stuck in it. Um, because there's always those different
Yeah.
layers to it.
So I'm hearing that you have, are you, I guess a clarifying question I have is like, are you in these different funds? Are you a collective working together running these different funds? Yeah, that's the first clarifying question. And from there, it sounds like there's layers of basically relationship between mutual aid and resource redistribution, right? Where those who are in, like, there's the people that you're in community with doing mutual aid work, because, like you said, it's not just about resource distribution, there's relationship building, there's community building, there's a deeper commitment of each other's well-being and building something together. And then there's that through through that collective then being able to raise funds to resource distribute to people who you're not able to be in this moment in a deeper relationship with and who are facing the extreme violence. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And to me, I'll answer the second question first and
Yeah.
then go back to the first. To me, in the world that we currently live in, with the levels of systemic oppression that we live with, and this varies depending on where you are in the world, right? Specifically talking about Turtle Island, in my opinion, there's almost no way to do genuine mutual aid without resource redistribution. Because what ends up happening if like a single community is doing it exclusively mutual aid without any resource redistribution, is that everyone is supporting everyone, but then you end up at a place potentially where no
Yeah.
one has anything left. And that resource redistribution is so critical because like to me, capitalism is basically like it's like punctured a wound into our community, right? And like we're spilling blood all the time. And the blood can be resources, right? So they're stealing all of our resources. They're forcing us to like basically pay to survive capitalism. And so to me, resource redistribution is basically like almost like a blood transplant,
Yeah.
right? It's like we're trying to salvage this. Um, and for me, it's like, so for example, if like let's say it's not like I was gonna support the
Hmm.
work that you're
Hmm.
gonna do, right? Or that you're already doing. Let's say I go and through all my networks and through the work that I do, let's say I get you $10,000
Hmm.
and I send it
Hmm.
to you, right? For your mutual aid work. What I just did to me is
Yeah.
resource redistribution. Even if we have a relationship and things like that, but I'm not in relationship with the people receiving the work
Yeah.
itself, right? But you are, right? And the work that you're doing could be fully mutual aid. And so that resource redistribution then allows you to do mutual aid with a little
Yeah.
bit more ease,
Yeah. Yeah.
ideally. Uh, and so I do think that the two are like go hand in hand, but resource redistribution, right, doesn't it's not enough, right? Resource redistribution is not about dismantling systems of oppression, right? It doesn't end up doing that. And so that extra layer of mutual aid is so necessary. And then in terms of your question about like the structure of these different funds, not only do I diversify the types of things that happen and the types of places that the funds go to, but I also diversify the types of structures that exist within each of them. So, for example, my first three books, so Blood Orange, Inara, and Desecrated Poppies, those three are a specific fund for queer and trans Palestinians in Gaza. And that's fully
Mm.
run by me, right? And I view it as mostly resource redistribution. Um, Parts of it are mutual aid because some of the people on the ground are people who are building things and I am in relationship with, and we are working to dismantle different things, or maybe they left Gaza, right? And now we're doing different types of work together
Hmm.
or whatever it is. Um, One of the other books, Whispers Beneath the Orange Grove, that goes to queer and trans Indigenous folks from Turtle Island. So that's also managed by me sort of, but I send that money then either if there's ever extra money, then that goes to other collectives of Indigenous folks from Turtle Island who then redistribute it so that they're able to fully control how that
Right.
money is redistributed. Because I also don't want to be like, here's exactly how this needs to be redistributed. You're welcome. I'm so helpful. That
Yep.
sounds
Yep.
very charitable. Um, and so some of them are entirely me. Then there are some funds that are more, um, it's never really large scale collectives, but different. I have a few that are different community run funds. Um, so depending on the time, there's usually at least two happening. And so that's run by different community members, where it's usually multiple people at the same time. And depending on the fund, some have a lot more layers of structure and some have very few layers of structure. So it could be that a group of people are just doing the fundraising and I am telling them where
Mm.
to send money to. And then there's others where actually there is shared decision making of like there's actually a process and a group of people together make decisions. And then there is one where it's like a much larger collective where that one is very, very, very structured. But because it's very, very structured, it means it moves a lot slower than the others, which is okay because the others are able to move fast. And then there's also the fund that exists within the nonprofit that I run. Um, because I'm also here to utilize basically like access to resources in whatever ways that we can. So literally looking into like launching
Yeah.
churches to
Yep.
support mutual aid because like nonprofits have access to things that orgs that aren't nonprofits
Yep.
don't have access to, right? Churches have access to things that no one else has access to. And for me, I'm like, let's access
Yep. Yep.
everything.
Yep.
Everything. And with the nonprofit, that's more of, um, I mean, within the nonprofit, it basically operates in similar ways. It's just the way that you can move money through a nonprofit is just going to look a little bit different, which again is okay because, uh, because I have all these other funds. And so, I mean, you mentioned like the Instagram fundraisers. So all of those go into the nonprofit, right? Because Instagram doesn't let you fundraise for like through their platform for
Mm.
a mutual aid group that doesn't have like quote unquote legal classification. Although on Turtle Island, technically everything is classified legally, whether or not you filled out paperwork. So even if it's a few individuals coming together to run a mutual aid group, that is technically a legal entity that has its own rights and things like that. It's kind of wild when you go into that level of detail. But the cool thing with something like Instagram, right? And this is why I talk about like different pathways for resources. So most of the people who donate to the Instagram fundraisers are actually people who don't even
Mm.
follow me. And so to me, these are people who aren't going to be donating to a GoFundMe
Yeah.
that I include. They're not necessarily going to come into my events, right? Because a lot of people are still scared to be a part of these conversations. And a lot of people have a lot of guilt. And a lot of people would rather just send you money on Instagram where it's fully anonymous and no one's going to find out about it. And you know what? I have thoughts in terms of world building and things like that. And also, through Instagram, probably raised like close to
Yeah.
$75,000. And so I'm like, I will use your guilt.
Yeah.
Give me your money and we will get this to places.
So what I'm hearing a lot, and I really like this, I mean, is the thinking of like diversity of tactics, even in terms of tactics of like specifically about how to raise money, how to raise funds, but also then of the ways of distributing them, but also with the distinction between resource distribution and mutual aid, and with communities of care. What I am hoping to do through this podcast, one of the goals, is to essentially be able to get to the point where we can start talking about mutual aid without having to refer to what it's not. Most specifically, charity. We're having those conversations, like me and Estra, and then with the episode with Dean. Um, but I hope to get to a certain point because I think one of the problems of oppositional thinking, of focusing on what a thing is based on what it's not, is that it has a tendency to fall into, I mean, there are a lot of problems, but one of them is that it has a tendency to like form false binaries or false dichotomies. And so I really like that you're talking about resource distribution. Um, you know, usually it's either mutual aid or charity, as though it's one or the other. But it's not just those two things. There are a lot of different tactics that one can take. But also, I do like the idea, or like, I'm really appreciating what you're bringing, wherein I think why mutual aid as a term has sometimes been co-opted, or why people use it for certain things that just is not mutual aid, is because it's kind of sexy. It has this kind of like political radical capital kind of thing. Like it just sounds, I don't want to be involved in a charity thing. Charity is the bad. I'm doing the good, the mutual aid. And so it is just like it's almost like codified good in a leftist sense, you know what I mean? But in reality, what we see is that nothing is good or bad. There is no defined, I mean, there are good and bad, but but with these types of things, it's not just as simple as I am engaged in the good thing, I am a good person. You can do mutual aid in a terrible way. You can do charity in a very like it was what people need. Research distribution, for example, I think is a very good term to be like, okay, this isn't like the ultimate thing, but this is what is needed. This is what specifically, marginalized and oppressed communities that I'm addressing are coming to us with. These are the needs that are being communicated to us. And so I just really appreciate this sort of like frank discussion and like this distinction of these terms, and not in a way that like, ew, I'm not doing the bad stuff. I'm doing this like, I don't know. I'm getting a bit petty maybe, but I just see this sort of tendency online. But yeah.
This is one of the things that's also coming up for me, especially like around the term resource distribution. So I'm thinking about Marxist-Leninist theory, right? And the whole like, oh, we need to seize the state and then redistribute the resources to the workers, to the people. Uh, but we don't, within that ideology, we're not actually even talking about how do we seize the state, how do we seize those resources in this moment? And I mean, one of the reasons why I moved into anarchist ideologies because anarchism helped answer that question for me around with mutual aid, with concepts of mutual aid and community care and all these. Basically, in this moment, we start with what we have, figure out what the system, how the layout of the system is, and maneuvering through that. And so, what I'm hearing for you is this reflection of something that I keep also thinking a lot about, which is those of us in position of power that have access to these systems to be able to sit and study them and understand them. Our role is to then figure out how to maneuver through these systems so that we can redistribute resources to the people to create more space for people to actually then get more politically involved, right? And so, yeah, I'm kind of curious about your ideological progression and how you reach this point.
Yeah, that's a great question. And first off, like I love everything that y'all shared, and absolutely, I think it's always kind of interesting because as I was thinking about this in particular, I think like what kept running in my head, right, is like, why does everything need to be called mutual aid? And there's some strategic reasons, right? Like Ayman, you kind of mentioned this. And so sometimes as you're leveraging power, right, for resource redistribution and things like that, sometimes actually it does pay off to use the words mutual aid, right? And so strategically, I understand certain things. Beyond that, I'm like, I I need us to pause, and by pause I mean like do more work, and also right, like let's really figure out what it is that our communities are doing, what it is that our communities are yearning to do, and also to me, what's even more important than like everything else is if you're the type of person where you're like, no, gross, charity is bad. I am good, so I am mutual aid. To me, I'm like, that is a big ego. And I need you to really check that because if you're bringing ego into mutual aid, it's not mutual aid anymore, in my opinion. Right. And I know that's a big statement and egos like fluctuate in a multitude of different ways. Right. But when the ego steps into this work, into collective liberation work in general, and we start making it about us in those ways, more likely than not, we are going to become harmful. And it doesn't mean that we can't pivot and turn around, right? And really fix it and grow and learn and all of that. We love all of those things. But let's have things to grow towards, right? We don't have to be like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm good. I have figured out mutual aid and I am good for the rest of time. And it's like, no, no, okay, cool. You're practicing mutual aid now, cute, but like, what does it look like in 5 years, right? Like, what's the next level of this? What's the next level after that, right? How do we continuously grow and move? And I think sometimes it's a lot easier for people to almost attach to something and pretend as if because they have this one thing that that's a representation of who they are as a person and they need
Mm,
to stay there. But the thing with mutual aid is that mutual aid should not look the same year to year if we are in fact
mm,
dismantling these systems,
mm,
right? If if one end is moving and the other is also moving in a direct, like it means that it's always a new world, right? So the mutual aid work that I'm doing now compared to a year ago looks different. The mutual aid work on a large scale that I did during COVID looks very different than now. And in different contexts, sometimes people will like compare, right? And so, like I mentioned, of like across all these different funds, that's like $500,000 of money that's gone out to people. And then other resources, right? So things like death work and therapy and a bunch of other things. But when I was doing mutual aid around COVID, for example, in the first 6 months of COVID, redistributed $2 million, and we fed 45,000 people a
mm.
week,
Yeah,
right? And that was launched within like two
mashallah.
weeks, right? But different crisis, different circumstances, different resources, different people, different everything. And so one looks a lot better than another, but it's also like, but it's a different
Yeah,
world.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like an immediately post-COVID world is a different world than an October 7th world. Different contexts, different politics, different things that we're trying to dismantle. And ideally, we're moving to dismantle all of it, but we have to acknowledge where we're at, and that's valid and that's okay. But I really would love like to invite folks to really reflect on that of like, how are you growing this? Like, what is
Mm,
next? Versus I'm doing this and I am a good person, and so I need to
mm,
live here now. And it's like, if you're doing this and you're a good person and you live here now, you're not effective anymore. And to me, efficiency is so critical because, I don't even know the percentage of resources that those of us trying to do this work have access to compared to everyone not doing this work, right? We have the smallest sliver of resources that are accessible to us, even when we have immense power as marginalized people, we have so little. And so I'm like, to me, we have to be so efficient and effective in the things that we do because we have to be able to make $10 like $100,000 for the
mm,
far right because they have $100,000 that they can just throw at something. Whereas for us, $10 might be a big deal at some days. Um, and so, yeah, really would love to like invite people to reflect on what that growth looks like because to me, all of these things can't be static. They have to constantly be moving, whether it's access to resources and resource redistribution, whether it's mutual aid, whether it's community care. So much of it is in flux. It's constantly moving and shifting. And that includes the structures that we come up with. That includes the people behind the scenes. That includes the people um, in the center of the scene, right? It includes everything is constantly in flux. And I find that the people doing mutual aid work who really understand it, if you talk to them and you're like, well, what did your work look like last year? And they'll give you a completely different answer. Or they'll tell you that they knew exactly how the world was going to shift in that year. And this is how they shifted their work. And so they weren't surprised, but the work itself has also shifted. And now I'm kind of forgetting the actual
No, I think
question.
you're answering like I mean, what I'm hearing is like this, the question was around like how your ideology shifted, but what and the answer is what I'm hearing is like this, having this like pulse essentially on the political environment that we're in and being in constant education of the moment and what's available and making decisions in that moment, but then also then re-strategizing and shifting your tactics as things are moving. Which is, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about my experience over this since October 7th, and like having to deal with all the systemic challenges, right? Banks foreclosures, platforms shutting us down, all the things. And each time, basically, not necessarily, even when you talk to lawyers and people who supposedly understand the system, they don't really have answers. They tell you, try this and that. It's like, well, I've done that. Oh, then I don't know. And so it's like this constant process of like, all right, what do we have in this moment? Let's make a decision as best as we can, knowing that this is not the quote unquote truth or answer, like the final thing, seeing what the result is, and then recalibrating from there, right? So it's like we having to be our own algorithms of like what it like changing, taking in data, adjusting as we need to go, and never getting comfortable in where we are, even when things are seem to be like working.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that last part is so critical and yeah, it's kind of funny with like all those bank closures and things like that. I don't know
Oh
if
yeah.
you've had to do this, but at one point during this was around like the first time Rafah was fully
Yeah.
invaded in February. Um, I had to learn
Oh yeah.
crypto,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
right? Like and
Yep.
and you just
Yep.
do it, right? Because you wake up one day and all of the other like all the other pathways
Yep.
are gone now,
Yep.
and you pick because
Yep.
we have to. And I think a part of this, in terms of like to the ideology question, I think like for me, and this is kind of why I always start with like the world I was born into, because I didn't learn any of this work from theory or
Mm,
from books, right? And and even though like I have a master's now and an engineering degree and whatever, of all of this work, right, is learned either from the people I grew up around, the organizers around me, the spiritual practice around me, the culture
mm,
around me, or from other organizers and literature by specifically like Black, queer, and trans, and sometimes straight women from like the 40s, 50s, 60s,
mm,
and 70s. Right. So thinking of like a lot of June Jordan or excuse me, or like Maya
yeah.
Angelou and things like that, right? Of like, but that was kind of where I learned a lot of things. And it was kind of interesting when I was doing my like master's dissertation, I did it on queer and trans Muslim utopia. So I've been doing utopia work for a really long time. And I remember at the time, I think it was like potentially my supervisor or someone else asked, they were like, "Oh, are you doing this as a decolonized like dissertation?" And I was like, "No." And they were shocked by that, right? Because in all of the spaces, I was the person that was like decolonization, 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 no white girl,
Mm-mm.
decolonization. Um, and and I didn't use that for my dissertation. And I have a line, and this is my favorite line out of the entire dissertation, and I love all of it because I was also asked of like why am I not referencing any of like the quote unquote fathers of utopia who are also like the forefathers of
Mm,
imperialism? And I
mm,
I just have a line where I was like, people like me do not learn about utopia from white cis men who write books that are too complicated for us to read as children. We learn it because we live
yep.
it.
Yep.
So I'm not citing any of them because they're
Yep.
not
Yep.
relevant,
mm,
because that's not where we're learning, right? Like I learned this by just living it, um, which is why like, and there's different opinions around this of can you do mutual aid if you're not impacted by different things? And I don't think the answer is a yes or no. I don't think it's a binary. I don't think it's that simple. I will say it's to know the level of awareness about systems impacting a person, the person living it is always going to know best.
mm,
And this is where like that relationship between what is mutual aid, what is resource redistribution and community care and all of that kind of comes in. But to me, I'm like, it's possible that people without that lived experience are able to really do this work in beautiful and healthy ways. And also for me, again, thinking of like efficiency and effectiveness, I don't want to. And so if I am not on the ground in a specific place and I don't understand all of the everything that's influencing the way a system is reacting to a person in a very specific space in a specific way, even if I can understand most of it, I would always rather just resource redistribute instead. Like, I don't have to be the one at the
Mm,
forefront of it. And so I see this happen with a lot of people where, they'll work with folks experiencing like houselessness or incarcerated folks and political prisoners and things like that. And they themselves have never had any of those experiences. And again, it could be done really, really well. It could be really beautiful. And also I'm like, but why? Right? I'm like, I want to give as many resources as possible to the people who have experiences that I don't. Right? I want to support everything that they are doing, center their leadership. And that in itself could be a lot of mutual aid, but why should I
mm,
run it?
mm.
Right? Like to me, it's not even a question of like should and shouldn't. In a way, it's just like but
Right.
why would I?
Yep.
Right? Like I'm like I have my 17 marginalized identities, right? And like and I have a lot of experiences and so like for example of like I've been unhoused for 4 years of my life across various countries, including Turtle Island, right? But also at the same time, I'm like I'm not currently unhoused. Like I understand houselessness in what's known as the US. And also I'm like, why would I not just support people currently experiencing it or who are more closely tied to that so that they're able to do that? And then I can go and focus on one of the 17 other things or like seven of the other 17 things because I'm also a limited resource. Right? Everyone's a limited resource, but it doesn't have to be me everywhere. And I think again, this is where like egos kind of come in and our ideas of like what is good and what is bad and what does it look like to be a good person and what does it look like to do good work and so on and so forth. And I mean to your point of like none of those binaries really exist.
Mm.
And especially when we're talking about like the world that we currently live in, and some places in the world understand this better than others, right? Where some places really understand underground organizing, and then other places are like, "Oh my God, what is that? That sounds cute." Um, what does that need to look like? And uh, sometimes underground organizing looks like you're the bad person because you're doing good work
Mm.
underground. And until we move away from that binary, it it just means that we're working against each other and not being as effective as possible. And so in terms of like my ideologies, they've definitely evolved over time, but they've evolved from the work, right? Not like I haven't read most of the theory that exists about mutual aid because most of the theory that exists about mutual aid was, you know, decades behind the work that I had witnessed or where I was at. Um, and unfortunately, there was no book when I was like 3 and trying to comprehend the world I was in that was like, here is mutual aid. Not that I would have really wanted one, to be honest, but yeah, so my ideologies have shifted over time, and also at the same time, like I don't necessarily like outside of being like the mutual aid work I do is fully built on lived experience, my lived experience in particular of experiencing this my entire life. Um, Outside of that, I'm like, I love a lot of ideologies out there, and I know like a lot of people are in mutual aid through like um, anarchism and things like that, and I love that. And also, to be honest with y'all, I've never read anything about like anarchist
Mm,
mutual aid. I know what it is because I've worked with a lot of people who follow that ideology, but I've also worked with a lot of people with other ideologies. And I'm just like, in the end of the day, I don't really care about ideology. I just care about what's happening.
yeah.
Are we doing things, whatever that ends up looking like? And let's continue pivoting and moving and shifting and yeah, so love a lot of things and also like to be honest, of like I actually don't know a lot of the theory behind things. I just know what I lived through and the work I do.
No, yeah, I think so. One of the things that we talked about very early on in one of the first episodes is I, in 2019, during the October 17 revolution in Lebanon, there's a lot of new ideas in the air, and sort of, I was looking at mutual aid, and I was interested in like, is mutual aid something, especially in this context of economic crisis and collapse, something that we should be thinking about and developing? So I did, and I'm not an academic, so I don't have access to like the databases and whatever, but there's really not much written like with the word mutual aid. I found, kind of to my surprise, that if you just Google mutual aid, I mean, it's very different now since COVID. I'll get to that in a second, but constant references to, the book by Kropotkin written in 1905, which is interesting, which is whatever. It's not really even theory. A lot of it is just like observations because he's a zoologist and he's like, oh, look, mutual aid amongst animals, mutual aid between species, mutual aid, and, mutual aid in the medieval town or whatever. And so and so basically that kind of shifted during COVID when also with Dean's book, but then a lot of, yeah, mutual aid chapters started forming, or what would name themselves as mutual aid for chapters. And then we've gotten to the point now, yeah, where you have police departments with mutual aid, whatever, and it's just like the most morbid co-optation of the term. But yeah, I think the thing is that there isn't actually, there's theory within anarchism. There's theories of like what this types of practice does, what it could do, what potentials, whatever. This will bring me to a question that I actually want to ask. I do have a specific question, but just to say that having done a bit of the research, there isn't that much written. So it's not that there's like all this stuff that you haven't read. There just isn't
Mm.
much written because in actuality, um, as Kropotkin identifies, this is a thing that organisms do, that all things that are in community uh, do, that this is how we have come to survive, how evolution, he calls it a factor of evolution. And it's just a thing that it's different for cooperation, right? Um, what I found myself doing, the only like Wikipedia page, because again, the Wikipedia page for mutual aid is not extensive. But I did find an extensive Wikipedia page on, I think, collective work, which had just like a bunch of different examples across the world of just, I don't know, the term in Indonesia for when people like help each other move houses, or when they build this, or during winter they do this, or this happens everywhere in every society across the world. That's how we survive. This is one of the goals of this podcast, is to kind of create one resource, one sort of space wherein, especially in the global south, especially in the peripheries of the world, that we can sort of like share, collate, and yeah, because a lot of them are also just, as Arabs, these aren't, we don't really have a word for mutual aid because it's a word, it's just, I don't know, wajib. Oh, it's what you do, you know what I mean? Why wouldn't you help your neighbor? It's just so matter of fact. Obviously, we don't live in an ideal world. We still live under capitalism and a lot of atomization and exploitation. But regardless, we've definitely had that conversation. Isra has mentioned several examples of like, yeah, cases where people are doing mutual aid and they're like, oh, um, you know, I wouldn't call it that. There's also like a fear of identifying with it as political.
Mm-hmm.
But the question I do want to ask, that I'm very interested in myself doing the work, um, that is mostly involved with like addressing the direct needs of the community like around me, or rather like the queer communities in Lebanon. And because we're constantly responding to crises um, that aren't going away, that are only getting worse and compounding, and so we're not able to get to that point of sustainability for people. Like some of the people we've been supporting 2 years ago, we're still supporting because all the ventures, all the attempts at them getting work or finding some other means of income just have fallen through, or like not fallen through. So I guess the big question, I guess, is how exactly do you see this work as? like contributing to or a vital part of the dismantling of the systems. I ask that because that's definitely a conversation we have a lot in the mutual aid group, where we hold these sort of like differing opinions, where some see it as a tool for survival of the community, but some see it also as not just a tool of survival, but also a thing of building a sort of like an opposition. You know what I mean? Like I think that's more how you're imagining it or you're conceiving of it. So yeah, I was wondering if you could speak more towards that.
Yeah, I love that question. I wrote it down because I do have some thoughts about some of the other things that you said, um, and I do want to go into the question, because I do want to highlight of that. So, like I mentioned, the community I grew up in, um, and especially the families that we were most connected with, were predominantly Black. Right, early on, it was a lot more Arab and South Asians and Black folks. But in the context of what's known as the US, everyone who's not Black and Indigenous to Turtle Island usually has a lot more access to building wealth in a way that Black folks do not. And so over the years, we moved to Arizona in 1998. Um, let's say the vast majority of people within the community were in severe poverty. Every year, people started getting out of that, right? And every year, it was less and less people because a lot of people assimilated with wealth versus continued assimilating with a poor community. And I say that because that meant that the mutual aid that I grew up with was heavily inspired specifically by the Black community members who were heavily inspired by the Black Panthers Party and Nation of Islam. And I wanted to highlight those two in particular in the context of what's known as the US, because I think those two are great examples of the reality of mutual aid, right? And I think it kind of goes into your question around like the politics of mutual aid, because what we see these days, right? All of these mutual aid groups launching, all of them are saying they're political, and yet, if you compare them to like the Black Panthers, for example, where the Black Panthers had um, it was a much more comprehensive form of mutual aid, right? Where there was access to funds, there was access to food, there was access to housing, and also there was an entire resistance section of it, right? And so like armed resistance was a part of it, right, out of necessity because the state was constantly targeting them. And so thinking of that, right, of that's one specific vision of a full-on political mutual aid, right? Of that mutual aid is not just, well, we had a sign and it told people our politics. I mean, that's cute, great. And also though, it like as we move farther and farther into fascism, right? Like it is it going to include armed resistance? Does your neighborhood have like guards supporting your community members, right, from threats? Like what, and by guards, I don't mean like call the police. I mean like community guards, right? Community marshals, community safety procedures and protocols. Are we investing in like transformative justice things into the community, in disability justice? Are we creating our own alternative pathways to Scott's earlier point around like building the alternatives? um, I think all of those become a part of like that larger vision of how do you actually sustain this? Um, and so I think like longer term, as groups are trying to sustain this, I think often what ends up happening is there's a lot of focus on the community building piece, which is really, really, really integral and important in terms of relationship building. Um, and also at the same time, like everybody brings something different to collective liberation work. So some people are the right people to build alternative systems. Some people are the right people to be thinking of how do you dismantle things. Some people are the right people to think of redistributing resources. Some are the right people to build just relationships with people. And I think I would love to see groups kind of moving towards that level of diversity, um, versus that we all have to be doing kind of the same thing and we're focused on this one thing. Like our focus is going to be relationship building. And that's, again, really beautiful, but relationship building within the context of the levels of systems of oppression that we're living through, is it's not going to sustain it, right? It's not going to get us to where we need to go. And so, what does it look like beyond that? What does it actually look like where, instead of um, kind of similar to that example that I had earlier of like you could give someone $2,000 and that $2,000 could just disappear, or you can give someone $2,000 and they fully understand that this is a community investment and will radically transform their community because even $200, right? And and to me, there's like there's a bridge there, right? And this is where we always go back into like the growth piece and how we're moving and how we're growing and so on and so forth. But for me, it's okay, cool. So like, what is that difference? Let's actually analyze that. Like, let's break that down. Like, what makes a person let's say two people barely surviving, right? Both of them need $2,000 for rent, right? Like we're barely surviving out here. You give one person $2,000, that $2,000 goes to rent and it stops there. You give another person $2,000, that becomes a community investment that can radically transform a community. And I always like to ask that question of like, okay, cool. Like, what is the difference? What is that pathway to move from one to another, right? And to me, a lot of that is really like the difference between individualism and collectivism. And I don't think I sent you my newest book. If I haven't, I'll send it to both of you. So, Whispers Beneath the Orange Grove is 8 essays, and it's basically an organizing manual in a way. And so it has essays about collectivism and strategy and moving underground and what happens when they come for us and what does it look like to actually take breaks. There's an essay on community care as practice where, to your point of like all of the ways that we would talk about things like mutual aid. Yeah, we don't talk about it as mutual aid in Arabic, but we have all of these um, concepts, these absolutely beautiful concepts, like things like takaful or tadamun, and like ways of cooperating with one another and showing up for one another. And so all of that is kind of in there. But I do find that really building one, the skill sets for people to be able to then reinvest in their own communities. And by their own, I mean like people can define community in all the ways that they'd like to. I like defining community across like a full spectrum of types of community. And so for me, like there's the community where like it's the people directly in my life that I can reach out to when I need something. They're the people who will take care of me and I take care of them, right? And it's usually very few individuals, whether it's in person, online, whatever it is. Then there's like the larger community, which could be like an identity-based kind of way of assembling with people that we feel at home with. And historically, that would have been queer and trans people who are racialized as Muslim for me. Now it's kind of shifting to predominantly trans, global majority disabled folks. And that can shift over time, right? But then that's kind of like that larger chunk of society. But then for me, there's the larger level, which is just like human, right? Like humanity is my community in a lot of ways. And then there's the deeper levels where it's, this land that I'm on is part of my community. The stars above me are a part of my community. My spirituality is a part of my community. Everything can kind of be a part of that community. But when we're taught to be individualistic, inherently individualism goes against mutual aid in general. Um, Mutual aid cannot thrive and be sustained without collectivism. It doesn't work because ultimately with individualism, we're always the end goal is always surviving ourselves versus surviving as a community.
Mm,
But like within my work though, thinking of it more from like a collectivist standpoint, it I don't I don't care about my survival in that way. My survival is a thing specifically because it is strategic for me to be alive to do this work
mm-hmm,
for the larger community.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If I die, I will also make that incredibly strategic to benefit the community, right?
Yeah.
But it's always like how we define ourselves and within the community, within collectivism, the I only exists within the context of community. And to me, again, across all of those layers of what is community, um, And I find without that shift, mutual aid always, over time, it's either that the system will destroy it, right? Will deplete every resource, again, because we're basically bleeding the entire time and exhaust people, or it will move towards some kind of assimilatory practice where it's going to assimilate closer to systems of oppression, and then it's going to look exactly like charity. And then you're like, wait, what just happened? How
Hmm.
how did this happen? But because the system is built that way, it's built to basically attract radical thinking and absorb it and send the message that actually the system is the one that's moving. Right? And there's a lot to say about system change versus system transformation and dismantling it. And both are really important work. But I do think that that collectivism is so critical. And I find more and more places, unfortunately, around the world, because of how influenced they are by like American and European and like British culture, are more and more individualistic every day. And so even thinking of like Palestinians in Jordan, for example, which is where my family lives and where I've lived, and you know, most people are incredibly individualistic now compared to 20 years ago, compared to 10 years ago even, right? We're moving towards individualism in a lot of ways. Um, and so my question then is like, okay, cool. So like if we know that's how the system is trying to absorb us, what what do we need to do, right? Like what is the pathway to move from individualism to collectivism? What skills do we need to invest into our community so that our community is able to do this work so that then we don't have to. We get to move to other things because we're needed in other places as well. And I think of that in terms of, some of my work now. And, when I first started doing this round of mutual aid immediately after October 7th, it was wherever money is needed, right? And that was very specific, very strategic, very like, there's a giant crisis. This isn't necessarily the time to do a ton more work in terms of beyond just queer and trans people impacted by genocide. Um, and over time, right, because resources go down because October 7th, it happened, and a lot of people can move past that. And there's a very specific psychological component there, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is bad when we hold on to a crisis and then we get over that crisis and we don't move on to the next crisis. But there's always another crisis. Um, but so the amount of funding that comes in is a lot less than it did 15 months ago. And so that means that automatically the work has to change and pivot. And so then that was an opportunity to go and change into, okay, cool. Well, like, where can money go where it's a direct investment into the communities that I am working with? And I work across dozens of countries and dozens of communities. Um, and I don't necessarily think mutual aid should be done in the levels that I do it, but out of necessity, it's going to happen. Um, but then it shifted, right? So then it started shifting into, okay, well, like who has interest in actually doing this work? Who has interest in really building these relationships? Who has interest in the building alternative systems and in dismantling these systems? And then it was like, okay, like how do I hyper support this group of people as I'm still supporting everyone else? Right? Like I'm really strategic in my shift. So it's not like overnight, it's like goodbye, don't talk to me forever. I'm just supporting this new group. That sounds very much like international aid agencies.
Yeah.
It's more of like you're always doing both to a different degree, but as resources are less, you just pivot and shift. Um, and so the shift over the last 15 months, and it's shifted quite a lot every several months, is that now because of the lack of resources, right? And there's still resources. This isn't like I still work from a place of abundance. But now most of the work that I do is investments in people already doing the work or interested in doing the work. And so that could mean that instead of just sending someone $2,000 for rent, I'm going to send them $2,000, but I'm also going to offer them a comprehensive training around doing mutual aid work, right? Or direct action organizing or underground organizing or all of them. Um, and so I'll have things like that as well. In addition to just, okay, here's money. So, and that's a relationship building community component of like, where do people most impacted want to take this work? Where do they want to go? What's missing? Right. And am a person with a lot of skills and I have access to people who have a lot of skills and who are fabulous trainers. And so it could be that like people are like, I really want to better understand things like transformative justice and conflict transformation. Wonderful. Like, let's make sure that person gets trained, but it's not, okay, I'm going to offer you this training and you're going to pay me to do it within like a capitalist like exchange structure. It's and I've been running this type of work for a really long time, mostly through nonprofits, is that I will pay you to develop these skills. Because to me, like skill building is labor. Political education is labor. The fact that you understand things and you're trying to figure out how these pieces fit together, that's labor. And so I will pay you to do that work. And what that does is then it makes it so much more sustainable because you're developing the next generation of people who are going to do this work and who are going to do other work that you don't want to do. There's a lot of things I have no interest in doing. I will do them when like it's necessary, but I'm like, okay, cool. So like, who do I train to do that work so that I don't have to? And it's not so I don't have to because I don't want to do anything and I want to step back and I have that privilege. It's more of like, again, I am a limited resource. Like each of you are a limited resource. All of us are limited resources. We have to be really strategic about where we show up and where we don't. But to me, it's not a question of like, I either show up or I don't. It's when I don't show up, I want to invest in the people who will show up. I want to make sure that someone is always going to show up. And then same with the work that I do. If I'm showing up in a specific area, it can't be me. Like people don't like it when I say this, but I think because of how I grew up and how I was raised and all of that, of like talking about assassinations is not a difficult conversation for me, right? And so I think of that, right? I think about political assassinations, whether it's like actually the state killing someone or various things that could basically just remove us from this work entirely. And so I think of that of like, if I am gone tomorrow, whatever that looks like, however that happened, what does this end? Does this work end? And sometimes the answer, the work should end, right? The work is good. Like we did what we needed to, and other people are doing other things. And then other times it's not strategic for the work to end, right? And so then it's like, well, who's going to do that? And that can't happen without additional skill building, without training folks to be able to do this, to not have to replicate everything from the ground up. And I will say of like, I wholeheartedly believe that the most marginalized and the most marginalized will always find the way to do things, right? So it's not what I'm saying. They will always figure it out. I had to figure it out. My family had to figure it out. People for survival, everyone will figure it out. My thing is like I don't necessarily think we have the time for every single individual to figure it out on their own and to develop these skill sets over years out of necessity and to go through everything that comes with that. And I'm like, actually, like, instead of you struggling for the next 3 years to try to figure out how to do this, let's do a training, right? Let's do a 2 week long training, 80 hours, and like, you will develop all of this and I will pay you. Right? Like, how do we, again, be as efficient and effective as possible? And so I think for like different groups, as they're thinking of sustainment, I really would invite y'all to think of like, what does this look like beyond just the people currently involved in it? What does it look like in terms of where it's a continued investment in people's growth and not just their survival? Survival is really, really critical, but especially as the levels of resources ebb and flow, the longer term is we're actually mobilizing people. We're actually activating people who want to do this work, right? I'm not saying of like we force people into this work. There are so many people who really want to do this work and they don't know how. They don't have the foundation and they don't have the skills yet. Um, but those are things that we're able to develop if it's something that they're genuinely able, like interested in and are willing to move towards things like collectivism and let go of a lot of that ego that says that I have to figure this out on my own and know this entirely on my own and I can't ask for support and it has to be this way or that way and it has to be perfect before I start. And it's like we don't have those privileges. So who's ready to move? And then also for those of us with some kind of semblance of power, how do we make it as easy as possible for people who are ready to do that. And so within my work, there's a lot of like the money stuff. And then there's also like, every community I go to, I try to do a workshop or a training. Um, there are communities that I will never go to in person, and yet we've done fully comprehensive trainings that, like corporate spaces or like big nonprofits will pay me like tens of thousands of dollars to do for them that I'll do for free for community because that's who I actually want to work
Mm.
with, right? Like, but there are so many people doing things like that. And so those skill sets exist within our communities. The skill set to teach people these skill sets is within our communities. The work itself exists within our community. Um, and for me, it's like, okay, well, how do we utilize all of that? Again, how do we become as efficient and effective as possible? And so, Ayman, back to your point with like the Lebanon Mutual Aid Group, um, of like, you're part of a larger ecosystem, right? Like, if there are conversations that y'all are like, we want to have these conversations, and also, this isn't particularly any of our areas of expertise. Cool. Who has that area of expertise? Like, and then also, are you willing for that person to come in and be like, okay, cool, I love all of this. Here's kind of like where y'all are at based on my assessment. I need y'all for like a 40-hour training, right? Are y'all then able to prioritize that? Because that's kind of the other end of it of like a lot of places don't prioritize things like skill building and these types of things. But to me, I'm like the amount of magic that can happen in a really good like intensive training is transformative, right? It's incredible what people can do. And I'll give you all like a couple examples of that. Um, of like, so when I used to train peer support, and I still do it a little bit, but so I'm a certified peer support specialist, and then I used to train people as peer support specialists, and then I wrote curriculums for different states and countries and things like that. So the peer support that exists in different places is actually just my curriculum at times. Um, but when I used to train it specifically on Turtle Island, it was usually rural spaces. And so if you think about what that looks like, the vast majority of time it's going to look like really Republican places, very white places, very cis, very straight. You might have like a single queer person that you come across in a 2-week training, but it's very, very, very white American. Um, and I used to love training in rural spaces because specifically those groups of people, like I will walk into a room and they just look shocked, confused. They don't know where to start. Um, they're like, what are pronouns? What is your name? What does this mean? What is happening? Right? And like, but the level of shock, like the shock to their nervous system that just my existence brings was so beautiful.
Mm.
And also because they were willing to be like, we don't understand pronouns. What does this mean? What do we do with this?
Mm.
We were able to move, right? We were able to have those conversations versus whenever I used to train in like urban cities or metropolitan areas. And again, it's mostly white people, right? But it's all these white liberals who assume that they are perfect and they know
Mm.
everything. So they're misgendering me and apologizing constantly, but not really apologizing, but are like, I'm perfect. We have nowhere to
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, you just robbed yourself of the entire growth. And within those 2 weeks, those rural communities would get there. Like we would literally move into like mutual aid and transformative justice and like dismantling like the entire behavioral health system and the medical industrial complex. And they will go there with me. Whereas like the metropolitan areas, we can barely touch any of those because they're not willing to let go of the fact that they're not perfect. And I'm like, you're not perfect. I need you to start
Yeah.
with that. And if you can start with that, we can go places. And so that willingness to like be trained and to move away from like, I have to struggle in this work. And I tell people this all the time of like, to me, collective liberation work needs to be like restful. It needs to be liberatory. Like if I despise mutual aid work because it's killing me and it's destroying my body, like, I'm like, what am I investing into community at that point? Right? Like, this is work that's about us. It's we're building all this together in different ways. This is our future of a liberated world, right? When we move to full just like community care. Um, and if we hate all of it, to me that doesn't present a really alluring like liberated world. I'm like, so we're just gonna hate each other? And I'm here for hatred. Hatred is cute. And also I'm like like if it doesn't feel good,
Yeah.
I'm like, what are we doing? And I'm not saying it always has to, but if like I know some people who despise like every organizing community they're in because of the harm that's happened. And that's very, very real. But I'm like, what are we doing? What is the culture that we're trying to build? What is the world we're trying to build? Um, but yeah, but accessing support and being a part of that larger ecosystem, because like y'all's work is important. My work is important. Everyone's work is important. How do we make sure that none of it is disposable, that none of it just disappears just because we haven't asked for support? And I see that happen like every other week. A new group falls apart, right? Or even like nonprofits that are doing really radical things or funders or whatever it is, because all these things are real. And also the amount of times where like I'll hear about an organization shutting down that I've worked with, and I'm like, it would have been so easy to keep you alive.
Mm.
So easy. Or also so easy for you to die strategically.
Mm.
Like, in my opinion, I don't want us wasting anything. And this is part of my engineering background of like, engineering is very much just problem solving and very like my areas of specialty were very much around like efficiency. And so I'm like, I refuse to waste anything of this. So even if an organization dies non-strategically, I will still benefit from it, like for
Yeah.
my work. But I'm like, I want to see it so much bigger than that, so much more strategy in everything that we do.
Yeah. Yeah, I really feel that. Um, wow, there's so much reflections right now I'm going through.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
same. I don't know if I have any questions prepared. It just, there's something that you'd mentioned that reminds me of this like short clip I saw from the US. Some right-wing person, whatever, was going to these protest and like was asking people
Mm.
gotcha questions. So he shows up to this guy and asks him, "How many genders are there?" And the guy kind of looks confused and he says, "Uh, I don't know. I just got here." And it's really made what you described about those workshops. It just really reminded me of that because actually that's like a beautiful fucking energy where it's like genuinely, actually, that is most of us. I don't know. I just got here. Like, if you're talking about gender, all of us live within heteropatriarchy, so we're all very much so in it. But in terms of then being conscious of it and aware of it and like thinking about it, um, for many people, they've just arrived. You know what I mean? Like, or like anarchist babies or whatever. They're like, and so having that kind of openness to learn, I think, is really powerful and important. And yeah, ego gets in the way, and sometimes it is more frustrating talking to people who know than people who just like actually just don't know. You know, and claim to know, but like it's that classic thing of like doctors and patients, the patients that know. Actually, it's a terrible metaphor. But anyway, actually, wait, there's a syndrome of like psychology students who like diagnose themselves immediately
Yeah.
when they first
Yeah.
discover
Yeah.
psychopathology. They're like, oh my God, I have this. It's like, no, you just found out about
Yeah.
something. But anyway,
What's really coming up for me is listening to you talk, Yafa, is just how much like you mentioned it when we first started, right? Like you, mutual aid has been part of your existence and your way of life from the beginning, from the moment you were born. And so your reflections now and the way you talk about this, that's what's coming up for me is like the way you think about the work, the strategy behind it, how everything is essentially about like, well, how could I use this for the collective, right? And how do we shift what we think we know so that way and whatever it is, we're helping each other, and we're supporting each other, and we're not only surviving, but we're thriving. And so I kind of want to go back to really your reflections on like you've mentioned it a few times where you've been in all these different spaces and you've seen it happen in different ways. You've seen mutual aid manifest in different ways. And that's kind of a question that we keep coming back to, Ayman and I, is like, well, how does this look like in different spaces? So I'm curious to hear about from you what you've witnessed and what you've experienced, and um yeah, and what you've taken in your experiences of like, oh, this is how mutual it looks like here, this is how it looks like here, or this is how I've witnessed it and experienced it.
Yeah, I love that question. I'm so excited to tell y'all some of the amazing things happening out there. Um, so a lot of the work that I do, in particular, whether I'm calling it mutual aid or community care or resource redistribution, across like all of them, I work from a place of abundance versus scarcity. And for me, what that means is that it's not about just basic survival. It's about if we're in this together, if we're supporting one another, it goes more than that, right? And so, as an example of that, of if like for example, someone has just been evicted from their house, right, and they need emergency housing. And so, and let's say we're this is more mutual aid, right? This is a person I know, they support me, I support them. And by me, I mean like the community, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be directly to me. There's someone we have a relationship with, right? We're building together in different ways. Um, I'm going to get them the money for the new housing that they absolutely need, and I'm also going to send them to a massage, right? Because I know what it's like to be evicted and not have housing
Mm,
for a while, right? And the stress of all of that on
mm,
your body, to be able to like reground and reset your nervous system, to be able to then like
mm, mm-hmm,
move, right? And whatever move looks like. But so it's not okay, well, you need $1,900 and ten cents for housing. And so I'm going to send you $1,900 and 10 cents. It's okay, cool. Maybe I'm going to send you
mm,
$2,500, right? And give you a little bit extra so that you're able to take care of yourself and the people around you in the ways that you need to. Versus the scarcity mindset, which is um, because everything is so limited, that means instead of $1,900, I can either give you that exact amount or I'm going to actually give you less because, other people need money and things like that. And that's very real in a multitude of ways. Um, and also, part of mutual aid for me, part of community care is it, like there's the dismantling systems part of it. But to me, that's on two different levels. So there's dismantling systems on like the systemic scale, on this larger, very macro scale. But then for me, it's also just as important to dismantle the internal systems on the micro level within an individual themselves. And scarcity to me is capitalism. And the fact that it's, here are limitations of what we're able to do, um, is a part of that, right? And it gets built into a lot of our spaces. And so for me, abundance is a thing that we could utilize to rebuild that culture, right? And dismantle those internal systems as we're doing this work, which I find as just as important as doing it on the macro level, because doing it on the micro level usually gives you more space and a better foundation and frameworks to be able to do the dismantling work on the larger level. Um, and so I've done, and I continue to do things like that. And the really cool thing is that, a few months ago, one of the people that I had supported, right, with something like that, more from like that abundance standpoint, calls me up one day and was so excited. They were like, "Oh my God, I just ran a fundraiser for like someone to support them with like housing, and I bought them a guitar."
cute. I love that.
Like they were so
So cute.
happy, right? Like they were like, I raised $3,000 and I got them a guitar. Right? And I was like, and that was just so heartwarming and so beautiful. And it was like, that's this work in
Yeah.
practice, right? Like this is that culture work, right? Where you're impacting one person culturally, and then that person then goes and impacts another person, then another person, then another person. And then all of a sudden, actually, like, yeah, like organizers should get massages or acupuncture or some kind of like somatic
Mm,
practice or go to therapy. And like the amount of times where people will be like, oh, like I'm going through a really rough like financial period, and so I got rid of
mm,
therapy, right? And within surviving capitalism, that's a necessity in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. And I'm like, actually, like, no, right? Like within my systems, I'm able to like get people access to things like therapy or peer support or death work or whatever kind of support like that. Because to me, it's like like if we give up all the things that are keeping us afloat, we have nothing
Yeah.
left in a lot of ways. And so that's kind of like that abundance approach. And so, when I go into communities, I bring a lot of that into different spaces, and even in like my trainings and things like that. And so I'll give you all some examples of some of the cool things that I've seen. So last April when the student encampments were launched, um, there was one campus in particular that out of the dozens of campuses that I had worked with, there was one in particular that I was like so proud of. And my being proud of people and places doesn't actually matter, right? It just like, but the way that they did work was so different than so many of the other encampments. And a part of that is that because I had trained a couple of them a year prior to October 7th, or like 6 months prior to October 7th. And some post October 7th, but prior to the encampments. And then a bunch of them had been trained by other organizers, right? And they're such incredible students, and they were the students who like were really interested in learning. And then by learning, then they would teach like elders, and they would teach community members, and they would teach each other and all of that. And so as all the vast majority of encampments were focused on divestment, right? It was how do we get the universities to divest from these things? This campus in particular also focused on reinvesting. And so it was a matter of like, okay, let's get you to divest, but we're also going to take your money and reinvest it back into our
Mm.
community. And so they were able to redistribute over $20,000 like directly um, into different parts of the community. They started different programs with like their unhoused population within their community. That's still ongoing now, right? And so it was like, okay, well, the school has to give us food because they kicked us out of our housing. And so we're going to take all of that food and share it with our community. And it was really beautiful to witness that. And then that group of students then now over the summer or into the fall ended up launching two different mutual aid groups, right, that are then redistributing like financial resources in the Congo, Sudan, and
Mm.
Egypt, like Egypt for Palestinians, because it's harder for them to get money
Mm-hmm.
into
Mm-hmm.
Gaza, um, and it's just like one thing built another thing. And so I think the really cool thing with how they're doing it is like they're doing the larger that macro level of mutual aid, which is more of like the international mutual aid and redistributing resources. But then they're also doing the same things within their own communities, which then means different people are engaged at different times and being mobilized. Um, and so that's like one example. I'll give like one other example of like the community in Oslo in Norway, which is one of my favorite communities. And um, it's so most people don't know this, but in Oslo, there's an entire neighborhood that's predominantly black and brown. And so I see more global majority people in Oslo than I do in like what's known as Oakland, which is saying a
Mm-hmm.
lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like every time I've gone to Norway this last year, I went twice. And did a bunch of trainings and workshops and things like that. I actually don't know a single like white
Mm-hmm.
Norwegian for the most part.
Nice.
Um, and it's such like a tightly knit community, and they're launching different things and just doing some really, really cool work. But so I've been supporting them on like what does it look like in terms of them doing that mutual aid, and they've always done some kind of like community support work and community care and things like that, where they do have each other's backs and various levels. But last time I was there, I was like, because like most places, a lot of people are experiencing burnout, and a lot of people are moving away from movements and things like that. And I was like, okay, cool. And so like, where do y'all go for somatic body work?
Mm.
And they were like, oh, we don't do that. And I was like, okay, so like, there's no one in the community who can do that. And they're like, yeah, like no one in the community is kind of trained for that. But I was like, okay, cool. Like, who's interested in doing that?
Mm.
And two of them were interested in doing that, in offering like that kind of support for the community. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, who do we fly to Thailand to get like a Thai massage certificate?
Yeah.
Right. And so now they're going to do that in the spring, right? Where
Yes.
they're working to build these different layers of support directly into the community instead of moving our money outside of it. And so even when I like send people to massages or like acupuncture or whatever whatever practice they want for their bodies, um, it's always within the community, right? And so I'm not going to send them to a white run spa at the Marriott,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm going to send them to a queer Black person who's local to their area, right? Or a trans Black person who's local to their area. Um, and in some communities, especially smaller communities, it means there actually is no one, right? The only place that your $200 can go is to a spa, but then the community sees none of that. And so when we build things like that within our communities, then, if I'm going to go get a massage for $100, but it's a community member, I just gave this person $100. Now that person has $100 to potentially go and buy like food from another community member. Now that community member now has money to go and buy jewelry from another community member, right? And all of a sudden that $100 actually stays in the community instead of that $100 went to a spa and it just disappeared,
Yeah.
right? And no one will ever see it.
Yeah.
Someone got paid minimum wage somewhere, right? Like, but it's not really of our community, and I'm seeing things like that happen in different places. Um, and so people are starting to kind of expand that definition of like, especially when it comes to like mutual aid, right? Of like, okay, cool. So like we're here together, we're doing this work cool, like we could fundraise for a single person, or like, what does it look like if we fundraise a larger fund that then everyone in our community who needs like gender affirming surgery can tap into, right? Like, what
Hmm.
does it look like to get like healing practitioners into our spaces? What does it look like to build a publishing house so that we claim our stories? What does it look like to build our own community centers and have that be the investment? What does it look like for us to like build something but then employ people in that something so that the funds always stay within our community? And this is, I think, where like a lot of that diversity kind of comes in, where like for example with like the organization I run, when I first so the organization has been there since 2011. It's been there for a while. It's one of the oldest queer and trans Muslim orgs that's still operational. There's definitely a lot older ones, but the vast majority have shut down. So it's one of the oldest running ones. And then I was the first executive director. And at the time when I came on, the budget was like less than $5,000. I think we had like maybe $20,000 in our bank account or something. Um, Very, very minor, right? And my specific skill set within nonprofits is capacity building, right? And redistributing funds um and things like that. And so within 12 months moved this org from about 20,000 to about $500,000. And I'm very good at what I do. And I'm not ashamed to admit that. And um but that means that now there's $500,000 that goes to queer and trans Muslims who are most impacted by these things.
Hmm.
Right. And
Hmm.
so it's not only that Meshed gets to be a part of like mutual aid redistributions, but also behind the scenes, people have health insurance because of this organization. People are getting paid salaries to be able to do this work that they actually are yearning to do instead of having to go and survive capitalism within abusive workspaces. And so to me, that's kind of like the future of how we do this, where to me, like, I want to see like holistic mutual aid where genuinely we get to a place of like where we're almost self-sufficient together, right? And even though that focus is no longer on like how are we directly dismantling systems of oppression, my favorite way of dismantling systems of oppression is to make them irrelevant. And I'm here for all forms of resistance. I'm here for armed resistance, and my risk is so high, I'm happy to admit it. And also, I think a tool that our communities have that's so powerful is making these systems irrelevant. And and that's happening in different places because people are building their own community spaces, their own like financial sustainability pathways, their own different things. And obviously none of it is fully sustainable because we know what happens when we build these things. Like in like what's known as the US, we've seen it with like Black Wall Street, for example. The government fully bombed the
Mm-hmm.
whole place,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we know what the state will do. We know what the state is capable of. And also I'm like, until the state bombs us,
Yeah.
we are going to live wholehearted lives and fully build everything that we are always meant to have. And the state is going to be so threatened that it will have to bomb us. But then we do that strategically where it's not wasted and that builds other work and then other work and then other work to the point of the state can't bomb us all. Because
Yeah.
if the state tries to bomb every single mutual aid group, if we're doing it at that level, if we all basically become like get to even not even the same level as like the Black Panthers, but like just move towards it. And we're that threatening to the state doesn't have the capacity to get rid of all of us.
Yep.
And so at some point, we're going to make them so irrelevant that they will disappear
Yeah.
because we'll have all the things.
Yep.
Like we are the fuel that allows like all these systems to continue running, which is why they continue oppressing us, right? Which is why inflation happens and why survival gets harder and harder and harder because they need us in these systems to take everything from us. And so when all of a sudden there's nothing that they can take from us because we're sufficient in a multitude of ways, or they can take so little from us because we might still be reliant on them in some areas. Um, it's fracturing them, it's breaking them apart, and it's ultimately showing people of like, actually, you don't need this, right? Like this myth that they've told us that we need them is so false. They need us always.
Yeah. That's, I think,
Wow.
yeah,
Um, that's deep.
that is the heart of it.
I think if there's a thread that connects something you said at the very beginning of the conversation when you talked about your not your first experience, but in Daraa during the Syrian Revolution and the sort of active forms of mutual aid and community care, which really highlighted a lot of or punctuated a lot of the early revolutionary actions of Syrian revolutionaries. And although a lot has changed in the last 10, 15 years, and we've lost a lot of people, and just the trajectory of the revolution has taken a very different path. But I think what we saw a few weeks ago, that the Assad regime fell not simply because of an armed insurgence by these groups in the north, but because the regime, it was like a house of cards. It just collapsed. Anybody who was, you know, police officers, soldiers, they just abandoned their posts because there's not, I think, like any really strong allegiance to this thing that clearly isn't working for anybody. And it's horrible, but I think is or has gotten to that point, did get to the point, like you said, that it was functionally irrelevant. And sort of once that movement started happening in the north, people in the south just started rising up, um, and sort of like spontaneously. And honestly, like one thing that I know a lot of Syrians are in conversation with about is the fears of, you know, not just around Jolani and the like, but this sort of political culture um, of whatever, like this sort of attempts to reassert the political culture that was learned and experimented on through the revolution, specifically through the local councils, which were communities of care. And I speak so much about those councils as well as the resistance committees in Sudan because they really provide this very concrete and like inspirational forms of anarchist organizing, or at least not horizontal, or at least alternative. Not that we want to overthrow the regime so that we can get a better regime, or overthrow this leader to get a better leader, but rather reimagine the complete transformations of power based on a kind of commitment to like neighborhoods, communities, with an emphasis not that we want a better government that we all vote for, but rather that um, we functionally make the state irrelevant because we're taking care of each other. Yeah, and the context in which these things arose, there's a lot of hopes, but also, and again, a lot of the people that did these went into exile and or were murdered. But there's sort of strong hopes that some of these will return as political entities, because I think that's huge. That's a sort of a really powerful, I'd say, alternative to the forms of organizing that we have, which is functionally like formally like nationalisms, and states, and very problematic institutions as they are. But I think, Estrada, do you have anything you wanted to say?
I mean, I'm just really simmering with everything you're saying, Yafa. I would love to have another conversation with you and dig more into like your thought process around structures, and like the building of these alternative systems and your experience around that. Um, yeah, and I'm just kind of simmering with everything you're saying. I think even for me in my own practices, you're bringing in a lot of things that I've been struggling with, and one, it's really nice to hear it reflected back in this way, whether it's the challenges that we're seeing, how to strategize versus like think about strategies and tactics and how that differs, and like what it looks like to diversify um, our tactics, right? And really think through like differences of community, and also the guilt around like is this alternative building systems of like alternative systems of power, or is this just resource distribution, and is it okay to do this right now? And so yeah, I'm like really kind of sitting with everything you're saying, and would love to just have follow-up conversations with you.
I love that. Yeah, this was really wonderful, and I'm always happy to talk about all of this. And yeah, I think it's, the level of complexity in this work. And by complexity, I don't mean that it's necessarily like hard work. But
Mm-hmm.
that it's deeply layered, right? And it's meant to
Mm-hmm.
to be evolving at all times, which kind of makes it complex. And yeah, so I'm always happy to talk about it. And I mean, what you just shared kind of also like reminded me of how, and I think about this all the time of how even the largest of empires, right? And so thinking of like what's known as the US right now, um, could fully be dismantled within days, right? Like, and we know that to be true depending on how it's targeted. And um, there's like been studies in terms of like how long a country can last if an entire sector of specific industries shut down. And so, for example, if like all doctors, and by all, I don't mean necessarily 100% of them, right? But like a significant amount of doctors, right, just fully stopped, like boycotted the medical industrial complex. The whole medical industrial complex falls apart within days. The whole country falls apart within days, right? Same with sanitation workers, same with so many kind of labor industries. And I think the biggest lie that systems of oppression are constantly trying to send our people is that we are powerless, that we can't do anything. And yet literally we can reimagine the entire world within days, right? Like all of it could be gone within days. And but like that's how powerful we are. And my question always goes to, okay, cool. Well, like, how do we get to that point, right? Like, why are doctors not a part of our movements in those
Mm-hmm.
ways, right? Why are people still participating in these ways? Why are sanitation workers not being fully mobilized? Why are dock workers, right, not being fully
Mm.
mobilized? Why are truck drivers not being fully mobilized? Because like it's happened out here of like if truck drivers go on strike,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
everything falls
Mm-hmm.
apart, right? Like they can hold on like barely, but the power that exists within that, right? And these are the roles that people like will like look down on in a lot of ways, right? But like these are the most powerful people. And so I'm like, okay, how do we mobilize that? Because this could be so easy. And I'm not saying that like rebuilding the world part is easy. And also, I do think that like everything that we've been talking about for me is necessary for us to get to a place where that is something that happens and that we're ready for.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
I think about
Mm.
this and I ask people when I'm in events, I'm like, if imperialism goes away today, are you ready? If white supremacy goes away today, do you know what to do?
Yep.
Do you know how to act? And it's so rare to have people who are like, actually, yeah, I know how to live in a liberated world. I've rarely ever had anyone be like, I'm ready. And this is across tens of thousands of people because we're not ready,
Yep.
right? Most people don't know what to do outside of systems of oppression. And to me, mutual aid is a space where we build the liberated world before it arrives. And so once it
Mm.
does get here, and through us that it gets here, we're able to actually build it versus revert back to other systems of oppression, um, and go back to the same world or a world that is just as oppressive, just looks very different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is, I mean, that is literally why I'm engaged in this work, this practice of creating something new in the shell of the old. Uh, and why, for me, like I've said it before, where it's like this, I feel like this is the biggest critique for social movements in our modern days. We're not ready for these moments. We have these power vacuums, and the only ones who are able to be ready are the ones who are able to just replicate what already exists. Yeah. Well, yeah, we've been at it for over, I think, 2 hours at this point. Really, like such a rich, rich conversation, and there's
Yeah.
like so much more to talk about. Um, but I think yeah, we'll pause it here. And really thank you for your knowledge and your experience and like everything you're bringing in. I'm just simmering and like bubbling over with just thoughts and reflections, and I can't wait to sit more with this stuff.
Yeah, I liked how you phrased it as a pause because I would definitely also love to have you on again. And just as a small message to our listeners, if you'd like to, let's say, participate in that second conversation, if you have any questions that this conversation brought up for you, that you would love for us or like for us to bring up in the second part, that we would, send to Yaffa. If obviously, if of course, premised on if Yaffa would like to come back, um, then please become a member of our Patreon or send us a tip with a message in our Ko-fi, which will be our tip jar. It's in the show notes. But of course, this is also a privilege of patron members, members of our Patreon. Also, will be in our show notes. Um, I just wanted to do that little plug before we wrap up. Good due diligence.
Yeah, we'll plug in also all of Yafa's amazing work, and the different groups they engage in, and we're really looking forward to just deepening our relationships with each other.
Yes. Actually, yes, that's a very good point. Yaffa, how can people follow you and where would you want people to go to look for your work or look for, yeah, ways to contribute?
Yeah, so the best place is unfortunately a lot of social media. So it's Yaffa's Utopia on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. And then also, if you go to Mirage Publishing, there's a newsletter that people can sign up for. I am going to be announcing soon some trainings that I'm going to be doing virtually. So people can be on the lookout for that. And then through that, basically all the links are there for all the books and for like the organization and things like that.
Excellent.
Okay, great. We'll have all that in the show notes then.
Yeah.
So great. This was fantastic. Thank you so much,
Thank
Yaffa.
you so much for spending this time with us.
Thank
It's
you so
been
much
really
for having me.
wonderful.
This was so beautiful. And yeah, this was beautiful. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
All right. See you next time.